London, May 1933. Margaret Wheatley stepped out of a Rolls-Royce on Upper Grosvenor Street, wearing a dress that cost more than most families earned in a year. She was 20 years old. Photographers waited on the pavement. They had been tipped off about her arrival at the Sweeney residence, where American golf champion Charles Sweeney would propose to her that evening over champagne. Her future mother-in-law had selected 3 weeks earlier. The engagement had been negotiated like a merger. Her father, George Wheatley, a Scottish industrialist who had built his fortune on the backs of textile workers in Dumbartonshire, had agreed to settle £40,000 on his only child. The Sweeneys, old American money with newer American debts, needed the infusion. Margaret needed the marriage. She had been beautiful for so long that beauty had become a form of employment, and employment required results. She smiled for the cameras because smiling was expected. But something in the photographs from that evening, preserved now in archives she would later try to destroy, suggests she already understood what she was walking into. The smile was perfect. The eyes were not. This is the story of a woman who had everything wealth could purchase and nothing it could protect. Born into industrial money and married into aristocratic titles, Margaret would spend 70 years constructing a life of flawless surfaces. Beneath them, something else was happening. The beauty that secured her value would become the evidence used against her. The wealth that promised freedom would fund her confinement. The titles she collected would make her fall more spectacular. What follows is not a redemption. It is an accounting. Ethel Margaret Wheatley was born on December 1, 1912, in Newton Mearns, a village outside Glasgow where successful men built large houses to prove they were no longer the men who had built them. Her father, George Hay Wheatley, owned 4 textile mills in Dumbartonshire. He had started with one, a failing operation he purchased in 1895 for a sum he borrowed from a shipping merchant who later regretted the loan. By the time Margaret arrived, George employed over 2,000 workers, most of them women who stood at looms for 12 hours and went home to tenement buildings George also owned. He did not visit the tenements. He visited his bank, where his account balance grew at a rate that seemed to justify everything that made it grow. Margaret's mother, Helen Mann Hannay, came from a family that had owned land in Galloway for 2 centuries before selling most of it to pay debts no one discussed. Helen had married George in 1910, not because she loved him, though she may have, but because her father told her that land was finished and industry was beginning, and she should be grateful a man like George wanted something her family name could provide. What George wanted was legitimacy. What Helen provided was a daughter she could shape into the thing her own life had failed to become. The house George built in Newton Mearns had 11 bedrooms. Margaret was raised in 3 of them, a nursery, a schoolroom, and the bedroom she moved into at age 7 when Helen decided she was old enough to sleep alone. She was not asked if she agreed. Children were not asked. Margaret learned early that her preferences were irrelevant, and her obedience was the only currency she controlled. Helen hired a Scottish governess named Miss Dunbar, who taught Margaret French piano posture and the specific way to enter a room so that everyone in it would turn to look. Miss Dunbar was not warm. Warmth was not part of the curriculum. George was absent in the way wealthy men of his generation were absent, present at dinner, invisible otherwise. When he spoke to Margaret, it was to assess her. He would examine her handwriting, her embroidery, her ability to recite poetry in French. He never praised her. Praise would suggest she had met a standard, and standards once met ceased to motivate. What he did instead was nod, which Margaret learned to interpret as conditional approval. The condition was that she continue. In 1920, when Margaret was 8, one of George's mills caught fire. 16 workers died, most of them trapped on the 3rd floor where the exits had been locked from the outside to prevent theft. The inquiry concluded that the locks were a reasonable precaution, and the fire was an act of God. George paid for a memorial stone in the churchyard. He did not pay compensation to the families. Margaret learned about the fire from a housemaid who mentioned it while brushing her hair. Helen dismissed the maid the next day, not for discussing the fire, but for discussing it in front of Margaret. There were things a child of her position should not hear, and things she should not remember if she did. Margaret's education continued along precise lines. At 10, Helen enrolled her in a private day school in Glasgow, where the daughters of industrialists and shipbuilders learned literature, mathematics, and the art of appearing intelligent without threatening male authority. Margaret excelled at all of it. Her teachers noted her discipline, her poise, her ability to smile at criticism as though it were a compliment. What they did not note, because they were not paid to, was that Margaret never seemed to relax, never appeared entirely comfortable, even when she was performing perfectly. By 13, Margaret understood that her life had one purpose: marriage. Not marriage to anyone. Marriage to someone whose name carried the weight hers lacked. George's fortune was substantial, but it smelled of factories and workers' sweat. Helen's family name opened some doors, but not the ones that mattered. Margaret's beauty, and it was becoming clear that she was beautiful in a way that could not be taught, was the asset they would leverage. Helen began taking her to Edinburgh for fittings with a dressmaker who worked for titled families. The dresses were not for Margaret to enjoy. They were investments. In the summer of 1925, George moved the family to London. He told friends it was for business expansion. What he told Helen, in a conversation Margaret overheard through a closed door, was that Margaret needed to be positioned where she could be seen by the right people. Newton Mearns had served its purpose. London was where transactions happened. They leased a house in Mayfair on Upper Grosvenor Street with a staff of 12. Margaret was given a bedroom on the second floor with windows overlooking the street. Helen hired a new governess, Miss Armitage, who had previously worked for the family of a minor baronet. Miss Armitage's job was not education. Margaret's formal schooling was over. Her job was refinement. Margaret was 13 years old. She had lived in 3 houses, spoken to hundreds of people, and been alone almost never. She had learned to dress herself in clothes other people selected, to smile at parties she had not wanted to attend, to accept compliments that were not about her, but about her utility. She had watched her father's workers from the window of his car and understood, without anyone explaining it, that their lives subsidized hers. She had seen her mother dismiss servants for minor infractions and understood that kindness was a luxury their position did not require. Nothing about this struck her as unusual. She had no other reference point. What she did understand, in a way that would shape everything that followed, was that her value was conditional. It depended on her appearance, her behavior, her ability to fulfill expectations she had not set. It depended on her becoming the thing her parents needed her to become. She was not a person being raised, she was a product being prepared for market. In photographs from that year, Margaret appears serene. Her hair is perfectly arranged. Her posture is flawless. She looks directly at the camera with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what is expected of her. She was not yet afraid. That would come later. The London house had a morning room where Helen conducted what she called preparations. Margaret sat in a chair by the window while her mother walked circles around her, adjusting the angle of her chin, the placement of her hands, the expression on her face. This happened every day for an hour. Helen would say smile, and Margaret would smile. Helen would say softer, and Margaret would adjust. They practiced conversation, how to ask questions that made men feel intelligent, how to laugh at jokes that were not funny, how to express interest in subjects that bored her. Helen kept notes in a leather journal. She recorded which topics made Margaret's attention waver, which phrases she used that sounded too clever, which gestures suggested she might have opinions. By 1926, Margaret was 14 and her education had narrowed to a single skill: being looked at. Helen hired a dance instructor, Madame Vacani, who taught the daughters of aristocrats how to move through ballrooms without appearing to think about it. Margaret learned the waltz, the foxtrot, the specific way to accept a dance partner's hand so that her touch was present, but not eager. Madame Vacani was strict about posture. She placed books on Margaret's head and made her walk the length of the studio until the books no longer fell. When they stopped falling, she added more books. Helen also hired a voice coach, a woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had trained actresses before discovering she could charge more to train girls who would never work. Mrs. Pemberton softened Margaret's Scottish vowels, lowered her register, taught her to speak slowly enough that men would wait for her to finish. The goal was not to sound intelligent. The goal was to sound like someone who did not need to sound intelligent. Margaret practiced reading aloud from novels she would never finish. Mrs. Pemberton corrected her constantly. Less emphasis, more breath, smile while you speak. They should hear it in your voice." Margaret never complained. Complaining was something Helen's journal would have noted. George paid for all of it without comment. He had moved his business headquarters to London and spent his days managing contracts with department stores that sold fabric his workers produced at wages he controlled. In the evenings, he read newspapers in his study. When Margaret passed him in the hallway, he would sometimes stop her and examine her as though she were a report requiring approval. He never asked how she was. He asked how her lessons were progressing. Margaret learned to answer in a way that suggested progress without inviting further questions. In 1927, Helen began taking Margaret to afternoon teas at the homes of women whose husbands had titles. These were not social occasions. They were auditions. Margaret wore dresses Helen selected the night before. She sat with her ankles crossed, sipped tea she did not want, and answered questions designed to assess her suitability. The questions were never direct. Women asked about her interests. She said she enjoyed reading and music. They asked about her education. She mentioned her tutors without specifying that her education had ended at 13. They asked if she rode horses. Margaret did not, but Helen had anticipated this. Margaret said she was learning. Helen enrolled her in riding lessons the following week. The instructor, Captain Morrison, had taught the daughters of 2 dukes and 1 earl. Margaret hated riding. The horses frightened her, and the side saddle position Helen insisted she learn made her back ache. But she rode twice a week for 2 years, and by 1929 she could enter a hunt party without embarrassing herself. She never enjoyed it. Enjoyment was not the objective. Margaret turned 16 in December 1928. Helen decided she was ready for partial exposure. Not yet a debutante. That would come later when the preparation was complete, but present enough to be noticed. Helen arranged for Margaret to attend a charity ball at Grosvenor House. Margaret wore a white dress with pearl detailing that cost £60. A hairdresser came to the house 3 hours before the event to arrange her hair in a style Helen had seen in a French magazine. Margaret stood in front of the mirror while the woman worked, watching herself become the thing her mother had designed. At the ball, Margaret danced with 4 men. 3 of them were sons of wealthy industrialists like her father. The 4th was the younger son of a baronet whose family owned land in Hertfordshire, but very little money. Helen noted this in her journal. The next morning, she told Margaret that the baronet's son was not suitable. Margaret had not asked if he was. She had barely spoken to him. But Helen was establishing parameters. Money alone was not enough. Title alone was not enough. The goal was both. Between 1928 and 1930, Margaret attended 37 social events. Helen kept a record. Teas, luncheons, small dinners, charity auctions, gallery openings where no one looked at the art. Margaret learned to recognize the hierarchy within rooms. Who had precedence, who should be greeted first, who could be ignored. She learned that titled women often had poor teeth and unfashionable clothes, but their authority was absolute. She learned that wealth without title bought access, but not acceptance. She learned that her beauty, which everyone mentioned and no one questioned, was both her advantage and her limitation. Men looked at her. Women assessed whether she threatened their son's judgment. Margaret was never alone. Helen accompanied her everywhere or arranged for someone else to. Margaret had no friends her own age. Friendship implied equality, and equality implied she was not special. Helen wanted her isolated in her specialness, dependent on the system they were constructing together. In May 1930, Margaret turned 17. Helen announced it was time to prepare for her debut. The London season, the series of balls and presentations where aristocratic daughters were introduced to society, and more importantly to eligible men, would take place the following spring. Margaret had 1 year to perfect everything. Helen hired a curtsy coach to teach her the specific genuflection required when presented to the king and queen. Too deep suggested desperation. Too shallow suggested arrogance. Margaret practiced for weeks until the angle was exact. She was not asked if she wanted to be presented at court. The question never occurred to anyone, including Margaret. In October 1930, Helen took Margaret to New York. George stayed in London. He had business concerns that required his attention, and besides, this was Helen's project. She had spent 15 years preparing Margaret for deployment. New York was a test market, a place where Margaret's carefully constructed appeal could be measured against women who had been raised with the same objective, but different methods. Helen told friends they were visiting relatives. She told Margaret they were expanding her options. They stayed at the Plaza Hotel in a suite that cost more per week than George's mill workers earned in 6 months. Helen had written ahead to women she had met in London, American heiresses who had married British titles and maintained apartments in both countries. These women understood the transatlantic marriage market. They knew which American families had daughters who needed European legitimacy and which European families had sons who needed American money. They arranged introductions. Margaret attended her first New York party on October 18th at the home of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt III. The apartment overlooked Central Park. The guest list included 2 Astors, a Rockefeller cousin, and several young men whose families owned railroads or banks or both. Margaret wore a dress Helen had commissioned from a London designer, pale blue silk with a neckline that suggested but did not confirm the body beneath it. She was 18 years old and had been trained to enter rooms as though she belonged in them. What struck her immediately was the difference in the women. American debutantes were louder than their British counterparts. They laughed with their mouths open. They expressed opinions about politics and art without waiting to be asked. They touched men's arms when they spoke. Helen had warned her about this. American informality, Helen said, was a trap. It made them seem accessible, but it also made them common. Margaret should remain slightly reserved, slightly European, slightly untouchable. Margaret met Peter Kershaw that night. He was 24, the son of a Pittsburgh steel magnate, recently graduated from Yale. He asked her to dance, and she accepted. He told her she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Margaret had heard this before. She had been hearing it since she was 14. But Kershaw said it differently. He said it as though it were a problem he was trying to solve. They danced 3 times. Helen watched from across the room, her expression neutral. Over the next 3 weeks, Kershaw called on Margaret 7 times. Helen allowed 4 of the visits. They sat in the plaza's lobby lounge while Helen occupied a chair 15 feet away, close enough to supervise, far enough to suggest she was not. Kershaw talked about his father's factories, his plans to modernize production, his belief that American industry would dominate the next century. Margaret listened the way she had been taught to listen, eyes attentive, questions minimal, agreement implied. On his 4th visit, Kershaw asked if he could take Margaret to dinner without her mother present. Helen said no before Margaret could respond. Kershaw stopped calling after that. Helen noted this in her journal but did not explain it to Margaret. What she told Margaret instead was that American men were easily discouraged, which meant they lacked the determination required for serious commitment. Margaret did not ask if Kershaw's interest had been serious. She understood that her job was not to evaluate men's intentions, but to respond appropriately to whatever intentions were expressed. In December, Margaret met Thomas Delaney at a Christmas ball hosted by the Whitneys. Delaney was 31, a lawyer whose family owned textile mills in Massachusetts, the American equivalent of George's Scottish operations. He was shorter than Kershaw and less handsome, but he had something Kershaw lacked: patience with Helen's supervision. He courted Margaret through the proper channels. He sent flowers with cards Helen read first. He invited both Margaret and Helen to the opera, to gallery exhibitions, to luncheons at restaurants where the tables were spaced far enough apart that conversation felt private, even when it was not. Helen approved of Delaney. She told Margaret he was suitable, good family, stable income, appropriate age. What she did not say, but Margaret understood, was that Delaney represented a fallback option. He was not titled. He was not exceptional. But he was available, and availability had strategic value. Margaret was not sure what she thought of Delaney. He was kind in a way that felt calculated, attentive in a way that suggested he was following instructions. When they spoke, she had the sense that he was waiting for her to become someone else, someone less controlled, more spontaneous, more real. But Margaret did not know how to be less controlled. Control was what she had been taught to perform. In February 1931, Delaney proposed. They were at dinner at Delmonico's, Helen present at an adjacent table. He presented a ring his mother had selected. Margaret looked at Helen, who nodded. Margaret said yes. Delaney smiled with relief. The engagement was announced in the New York Times the following week. Helen began planning a wedding for June. In April, Delaney's mother visited Margaret at the plaza. She brought fabric samples for Margaret to review, options for her wedding dress and the bridesmaids' gowns. She talked about the church in Boston where the ceremony would take place, the reception at the family estate, the guest list that included 2 senators and a former governor. Then she mentioned almost casually that Thomas had been engaged once before, 3 years earlier, to a woman from Philadelphia whose family owned department stores. The engagement had ended when the woman's father discovered Thomas's textile mills employed children as young as 12. The father had called off the wedding publicly. Thomas's mother wanted Margaret to know this in case it came up. She said it as though it were a minor biographical detail, not a reason to reconsider. Margaret told Helen that evening. Helen's response was immediate. She sent a telegram to George in London, and within 48 hours they were packing. Helen told Delaney's mother that Margaret had received urgent news from Scotland, a family matter that required her immediate return. The engagement was quietly dissolved. No explanation was provided in the newspapers. The Times ran a brief notice that the wedding had been postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. They sailed back to London on May 2nd. Helen did not discuss what had happened. Margaret understood that the American experiment had failed, not because of anything she had done, but because the men available to her were not what they appeared to be. Margaret was presented at court in May 1931, 3 weeks after returning from New York. She wore a regulation white gown with a train that required 2 attendants to manage. She practiced the curtsy 50 times before the ceremony. When she finally knelt before King George V and Queen Mary, her form was perfect. The king did not look at her face. The queen nodded once. Margaret backed out of the throne room without tripping on her train, which Helen later said was the most important part. The London season that followed included 43 events over 8 weeks. Margaret attended all of them. She danced with younger sons, eldest sons, men whose titles came with estates and men whose titles came with debt. She was photographed at Ascot, at Henley, at a garden party in Buckinghamshire, where she wore a hat that cost more than the gardener's annual salary. Tatler magazine called her the most photographed debutante of 1931. Helen kept every clipping, but no proposals came. Men looked at Margaret. They danced with her. They told her she was beautiful. Then they married other women. By the end of 1931, 7 men Margaret had danced with more than once had announced engagements to women who were less beautiful but more connected, or less wealthy but more titled, or simply less supervised by mothers who made courtship feel like contract negotiation. Helen did not panic visibly. She adjusted. If British aristocrats were resistant, she would pursue men who had already purchased their way into British society. Wealthy Americans who had married titles and now moved between London and New York. These men understood the exchange rate between money and legitimacy. They would not be confused about what Margaret offered. Charles Sweeney was one of them. His father, Robert, had made a fortune in Colorado mining, before losing most of it in the 1907 panic. What remained was enough to buy proximity to society, but not membership. Robert's wife, Margaret, the elder Margaret, after whom young Margaret would later claim she was partially named, had been born Margaret Hollingworth, daughter of a California railroad man. She married Robert in 1900 and spent the next 30 years converting Western money into Eastern respectability. Her son Charles was part of that conversion. Charles was born in 1909, 3 years before Margaret Wheatley. He was raised in London after his mother decided that European society was more willing to overlook American origins than American society was. He was educated at Eton despite not being British, an arrangement that cost his mother considerable money and effort. By 1925, he was playing amateur golf at a championship level. The sport that had made his father's Western mining fortune seemed less crude. By 1930, he had won several tournaments and was being photographed at the same society events Margaret attended. Helen noticed him in 1932. She noted in her journal that Charles Sweeney was acceptable if necessary. Acceptable meaning American, necessary meaning her daughter was 20 and still unmarried. Helen arranged an introduction through Mrs. Sweeney, who understood immediately what was being proposed. The 2 mothers met for lunch at Claridge's in November 1932. No notes of that conversation survive, but 2 weeks later Charles appeared at a dinner party Helen and George hosted at Upper Grosvenor Street. Margaret was seated next to him. Charles was 23. He was handsome in the way athletes are handsome, physical rather than refined. He talked about golf tournaments, about courses he had played in Scotland and France, about a recent match where he had beaten a minor earl, and the earl had been quietly furious. Margaret listened. She had been trained to listen to men discuss things she did not care about, and she performed that training well. Charles seemed pleased. He asked if she played golf. She said she did not, but would enjoy learning. This was untrue, but truth was not what was being negotiated. Charles called on Margaret 6 times over the next 2 months. Helen supervised all of them. The courtship was efficient. Charles was not a man who required prolonged persuasion. He understood what Margaret's family could provide, money that would shore up his mother's declining social position, a beautiful wife who would look appropriate at the events he attended, a connection to Scottish industrial wealth that sounded better in conversation than Colorado mining. What Margaret's family understood was that Charles provided American mobility and European exposure without the complications of British aristocratic families who might investigate George's labor practices too closely. On March 12, 1933, Charles proposed. They were at dinner at the Savoy, Helen and Mrs. Sweeney present at a table 10 feet away. Charles presented a ring his mother had purchased at Cartier using money she had borrowed against her late husband's estate. Margaret accepted. The engagement was announced in the Times, the Telegraph, and Tatler. The wedding was scheduled for 2 months later. Helen and Mrs. Sweeney managed the ceremony together. It would take place at Brompton Oratory, Catholic, which the Sweeneys were and the Wheatleys were not. But Helen conceded this point because the venue's grandeur mattered more than its denomination. The guest list included 400 people. George agreed to pay for everything except Charles's honeymoon travel, which Mrs. Sweeney covered. The negotiations about Margaret's settlement took 3 weeks. George's solicitor and Mrs. Sweeney's solicitor exchanged letters detailing precisely what would be transferred to Margaret, what would remain in trust, and what would be accessible to Charles under what conditions. The final agreement gave Margaret £40,000 outright, and a trust that would provide additional income. Charles received nothing directly, but he would have access to Margaret's funds once they were married. Margaret was not present for these negotiations. She was being fitted for her wedding dress, white silk with a 15-foot train, seed pearls sewn across the bodice, a veil that required 3 women to attach properly. The dress cost £250. Helen paid without hesitation. The dress was an advertisement. The wedding took place on May 21, 1933. Margaret walked down the aisle at Brompton Oratory on her father's arm. George's expression was neutral. He was delivering a product he had spent 20 years refining. Margaret's expression was also neutral. She had been trained not to reveal what she felt, and by this point she might not have known. Charles smiled throughout the ceremony. The reception was held at Grosvenor House. Champagne was served, speeches were made, no one mentioned love. Margaret became pregnant in August 1933, 3 months after the wedding. She was 20 years old and had never been alone with a doctor without her mother present. The pregnancy was confirmed by a physician in Mayfair, whom Helen selected. Charles was not in the room when Margaret received the news. He was in Scotland playing in a tournament at St. Andrews. Helen sent him a telegram. He responded with congratulations and said he would return to London after the final round. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Margaret experienced nausea that lasted beyond the first trimester. She lost weight instead of gaining it. By November, Helen had moved into the house Margaret and Charles had leased in Mayfair, a 4-story townhouse on Hill Street that George had paid for. Helen told Margaret she was there to help. What she did instead was supervise. She hired nurses, interviewed obstetricians, arranged for a private room at a nursing home in Welbeck Street. She also dismissed the cook Margaret had hired and replaced her with someone who prepared meals Helen approved. Charles was absent in ways that felt deliberate. He traveled for golf tournaments, Scotland in September, France in October, Ireland in November. When he was in London, he spent evenings at his club. He told Margaret the smoke and noise of the house made him restless. Margaret did not argue. Arguing required energy she no longer had. Frances Helen was born on March 24, 1934, at the Welbeck Street nursing home after a labor that lasted 19 hours. The delivery caused damage. Tearing that required surgical repair and left Margaret with chronic pain the doctors said would fade, but never entirely did. She hemorrhaged badly enough that she required a transfusion. Helen was present throughout. Charles arrived 4 hours after the birth, still wearing his golf clothes. He looked at his daughter briefly, told Margaret she had done well, and left to telephone his mother in New York. Margaret was expected to recover quickly. Helen had arranged for a monthly nurse, a woman named Nurse Patterson, who had worked for titled families and knew how to manage new mothers who were not bonding appropriately with their infants. Margaret found breastfeeding painful and unsuccessful. Her milk came in late and inadequately. Nurse Patterson suggested formula. Helen agreed. By the end of April, Frances was being bottle-fed by staff while Margaret remained in bed, recovering from complications the doctors were no longer calling temporary. Charles returned to tournament play in May. Margaret was still not well enough to travel with him, and Helen discouraged the attempt. What Margaret needed, Helen said, was rest and routine. What she provided was isolation. Margaret spent most of 1934 in the Hill Street house, attended by nurses and maids, seeing almost no one except Helen and the rotating staff. Frances was raised one floor above her, cared for by Nurse Patterson, and later by a nanny Helen hired from an agency that specialized in aristocratic households. Margaret's second pregnancy was confirmed in January 1935. She had not wanted to become pregnant again so soon. The doctors had advised waiting at least a year, but Charles had expectations, and expectations had consequences. This pregnancy was worse than the first. Margaret developed severe anemia. Her blood pressure rose to dangerous levels. By her 6th month, she was on bed rest. Helen moved back into the house. Brian Charles was born on November the 6th, 1935, 6 weeks premature. The birth was faster than Frances's, but more violent. Margaret hemorrhaged again, more severely this time. She required 2 transfusions and emergency surgery. The surgeon, Dr. Carruthers, told Helen afterward that Margaret's uterus had been badly damaged. Another pregnancy would likely kill her. Helen relayed this information to Charles, who said he understood. She did not relay it to Margaret until 3 weeks later, after Margaret had asked why she felt so weak. Margaret was 23 years old. She had 2 children she barely knew and a body that had been permanently altered by their production. The chronic pain from Frances's birth had worsened. Dr. Carruthers prescribed laudanum for the pain and phenobarbital for the anxiety that appeared after Brian's birth. Margaret took both. The dosages increased over the following year. She did not mother her children in any traditional sense. She saw them at scheduled times, an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, when the nanny would bring them to the drawing room, and Margaret would sit with them while attempting to appear maternal. Frances was quiet and watchful. Brian cried frequently. Margaret found the crying intolerable. It triggered something in her: panic, rage, a desperate need for silence. She never struck the children. She simply handed them back to the nanny and left the room. Helen observed all of this and said nothing about Margaret's detachment. What she said instead was that Margaret needed to maintain her appearance. The pregnancies had changed her body. Her waist was thicker. Her breasts had lost their shape. Helen arranged for a corsetier to visit weekly, for treatments at a beauty salon on Bond Street, for a masseuse who specialized in post-pregnancy restoration. Margaret complied. Her body was still the asset that justified everything else. Charles resumed his life as though nothing had changed. He played golf, he attended parties, he was photographed at Ascot and Goodwood looking relaxed and handsome. When journalists asked about his family, he said his wife and children were well. He did not mention that he rarely saw them. By 1937, Margaret had increased her laudanum dosage without consulting Dr. Carruthers. She was also drinking, sherry in the afternoon, gin in the evening. Helen noticed but did not intervene. What mattered was that Margaret continued to appear at the social events that maintained her visibility. And she did. She attended charity luncheons, gallery openings, weekend parties at country estates. She wore dresses that disguised the weight she had not lost. She smiled in photographs. She never brought her children. Frances and Brian were raised by staff. They called their mother Mummy when instructed to, but the word had no warmth attached to it. Margaret was a woman who appeared at scheduled intervals, smelling of perfume and something medicinal underneath, who kissed them without touching them, who left before they could ask her to stay. In December 1939, Frances turned 5 and Brian turned 4. They had a birthday party at the Hill Street house. Margaret attended for 20 minutes. She sat in a chair while the children opened presents the nanny had selected. Then she excused herself, went upstairs, and took enough laudanum that she slept through dinner. Britain declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, 1939. Margaret was at the Hill Street house when Chamberlain's announcement came over the wireless. Charles was in Scotland. Helen was in the drawing room with her, and they listened together without speaking. When it ended, Helen said they would need to make arrangements. She did not specify what kind. The arrangements involved sending the children away. By October, Frances and Brian were living with their nanny in a cottage in Oxfordshire that George had rented. The cottage was far enough from London to be considered safe, close enough that it appeared Margaret cared about proximity. Margaret visited twice in the first 6 months, once in November, once in February. Each visit lasted less than 3 hours. She brought toys the children were too old or too young for. She sat in the cottage parlor while the nanny served tea. Frances asked when they would come home. Margaret said soon, which was not true. Brian cried when she left. Margaret did not turn around. London society adjusted to war by pretending it was temporary. Blackout curtains went up, but parties continued. Food rationing was announced, but the restaurants Margaret frequented found ways around it. Gas masks were distributed, but no one Margaret knew carried them to evening events. The threat was real. The Blitz would start in September 1940, but in early 1940, the threat was still mostly theoretical, and theory was easy to ignore. Margaret continued her routine. She lunched at the Ritz, dined at the Savoy, attended cocktail parties in Belgravia where people discussed the war as though it were happening somewhere else. Charles was in London more often now. Golf tournaments had been suspended, and his usual escapes were unavailable. His presence made Margaret more aware of how little they had in common. They shared a house and a surname. They did not share conversation. The Blitz began on September 7th, 1940. German bombers came at night. Air raid sirens sent people to shelters, tube stations, reinforced basements, public facilities designed for mass evacuation. Margaret and Charles had a reinforced cellar beneath the Hill Street house. They went down there when the sirens sounded, along with the staff who had not already left London. Margaret brought her laudanum. Charles brought whiskey. They sat on camp beds while bombs fell on the East End, on the docks, on neighborhoods where people who worked in George's factories had relatives. The Blitz continued for 8 months, 57 consecutive nights of bombing, then intermittent attacks through May 1941. 43,000 civilians died. Margaret lost no one she knew personally. The bombs fell east and south, Stepney, Whitechapel, Bermondsey, areas Margaret had never visited. The Mayfair house was hit once in November 1940 when a bomb landed 3 streets away and shattered the windows on the north side. George paid for repairs. The house was restored by January. Margaret did not evacuate. Helen suggested it. There were estates in Scotland, country houses owned by George's business associates, where Margaret could wait out the bombing in safety. But leaving would have required Margaret to make a decision, and decisions required clarity she no longer had. The laudanum kept her steady, but distant. She moved through days without fully inhabiting them. The war was loud and present, but it did not touch her directly, and what did not touch her directly did not seem entirely real. Charles joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in 1941. He was 32, past the age of conscription, but volunteering gave him purpose that golf had not. He was assigned to a training role, teaching navigation to younger pilots at a base in Lincolnshire. He was not sent into combat. Margaret was not sure if this relieved or disappointed him. He came home on leave every 6 weeks. The visits were formal. They slept in separate rooms. They barely spoke. In 1942, Margaret attended a charity ball at the Dorchester Hotel to raise funds for war widows. The Dorchester was considered bomb-proof, reinforced concrete, deep foundations. Society had relocated there. Women wore evening gowns. Men wore uniforms or dinner jackets, depending on their service status. Margaret wore black silk and pearls. She danced with an American colonel who told her she was the most beautiful woman in London. She had heard this before the war. She would hear it after. The compliment had no more meaning than the war rationing that somehow never affected the Dorchester's champagne supply. The charitable cause was legitimate. Thousands of women had lost husbands. But the ball was not about them. It was about the people attending, who needed to feel they were contributing while maintaining the routines that proved they had not been fundamentally changed. Margaret bought a raffle ticket. She did not win. She went home at midnight and took her medicine. Frances and Brian remained in Oxfordshire through 1943. Margaret visited 4 times that year. The visits grew shorter. By the 4th visit in November, she stayed less than an hour. Frances was 9. She had learned not to expect her mother's presence to mean anything. Brian was 8 and had stopped asking when they would return to London. The nanny, Miss Crawford, had become more parent than employee. She was the one who comforted them, who remembered their birthdays, who noticed when they were sick. Margaret paid Miss Crawford's salary. That was the extent of her maternal contribution. Charles was reassigned in 1944 to a desk position in London. The invasion of Normandy had begun. The war's end was becoming imaginable. Charles came home to Hill Street every night, and the house felt smaller with him in it. They ate dinner together because it was expected. They talked about nothing important. Margaret increased her laudanum again. Charles started drinking earlier in the day. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. People filled the streets. Strangers embraced. Churchill gave a speech. Margaret heard the celebration from her bedroom window. She did not go outside. Helen came to the house that evening and said it was over. Margaret said yes, though she was not certain what it referred to. The war had not changed her life in any way that mattered. She had lost nothing. She had gained nothing. She had simply waited for something to end that had never truly begun for her. Frances and Brian returned to London in June 1945. They had been gone nearly 6 years. Frances was 11. Brian was 9. They recognized their mother by sight, but not by feel. Margaret looked at them in the Hill Street entrance hall and realized she had no idea what to say. Charles filed for divorce in February 1946. Margaret was not surprised. They had been married for 13 years and had not touched each other in 4. What surprised her was that he filed first. She had assumed, in the vague way she assumed most things by this point, that whoever left would be whoever cared less. She had not realized Charles cared enough to take action. The grounds were standard: mutual incompatibility, irretrievable breakdown. Charles's solicitor phrased it carefully to avoid scandal. There was no mention of Margaret's laudanum dependence or Charles's drinking or the separate bedrooms or the years of absence. The divorce was presented as a civilized dissolution between 2 people who had married young and discovered they were unsuited. The Times ran a brief notice. Tatler mentioned it on page 12. The question of the children was resolved quickly because Margaret did not contest it. Charles wanted custody. His solicitor argued that he could provide stability. He had left the RAF and was working for an American investment firm in London with regular hours and steady income. Margaret's solicitor did not argue against this. What he argued was that Margaret should retain visiting rights and that Charles should continue her financial support. The settlement was agreed upon in April. Charles would have full custody. Margaret would receive £12,000 annually. She would see the children on scheduled visits, once monthly, supervised if Charles deemed it necessary. Margaret signed the papers on April 22, 1946. She was 33 years old. She had been married half her adult life and was now unmarried with 2 children. She would see 12 times a year. Helen told her this was an opportunity. The marriage had been a mistake. Charles had never been sophisticated enough, ambitious enough, titled enough. Now Margaret could start again. She was still beautiful. She still had money. The war had reset certain social rules. Women were divorcing without complete ruin. Margaret could position herself as available. The house on Hill Street belonged to Charles. Margaret moved to a flat in Grosvenor Square that George leased for her. It was smaller, 5 rooms instead of 4 floors. But Helen said smaller was more appropriate for a woman alone. Margaret hired a maid and a cook. She did not hire a nanny. The children would not be living with her. Helen began the reinvention immediately. Margaret needed new clothes. The wardrobe from her marriage looked matronly now. Helen took her to Norman Hartnell, the designer who dressed the royal family. They commissioned 6 evening gowns, 4 cocktail dresses, 3-day suits. The bill came to £800. George paid. Helen also arranged for Margaret to resume treatments at Elizabeth Arden on Bond Street, facials, massages, hair treatments that would restore the luster the last decade had dulled. Margaret complied with all of it. She had spent her entire life being shaped by other people's plans. This was simply another shaping. She sat for fittings. She attended salon appointments. She allowed herself to be measured, adjusted, improved. The laudanum made it easier. Everything felt distant, manageable, like something happening to someone else. By June, Helen decided Margaret was ready to re-enter circulation. She arranged invitations to garden parties, race meetings, weekend gatherings at country houses. Margaret attended all of them. She wore the new clothes. She smiled. She danced with men who were either younger than Charles or older than George. Some were titled. Some were divorced themselves. Some were married, but attending parties without their wives. Margaret met Colonel Duncan at Ascot in July 1946. He was 48, recently widowed, the younger son of an earl whose estate in Hampshire was entailed to his older brother. Duncan had served in North Africa and Italy. He had a limp from a wartime injury and a pension that was adequate but not generous. He was exactly the kind of man Helen had told Margaret to avoid. Too old, no real prospects, no fortune to speak of. But he was charming in a way Charles had never been. He talked to Margaret as though her responses mattered. He asked questions about her life and seemed to listen to her answers. They had an affair that lasted 3 months. Margaret met him twice a week at his flat in Chelsea. They drank gin, they went to bed. Afterward, Duncan talked about the war, not the strategic parts, but the absurd parts, the moments when death was so close that everything became funny. Margaret found this easier than conversation about art or literature or the things she was supposed to care about. Duncan did not ask her to pretend. Helen found out in October. One of her friends had seen Margaret entering Duncan's building. Helen confronted Margaret at the Grosvenor Square flat. She did not shout. She explained very calmly that Margaret's value depended on her reputation, and her reputation depended on discretion. An affair with a widowed colonel who had no money and no title was not discreet. It was desperate. If Margaret wanted to remarry well, she needed to end this immediately. Margaret ended it. She wrote Duncan a letter saying she could not see him anymore. He responded with a letter saying he understood. She burned both letters in the fireplace and increased her laudanum dosage. By early 1947, Margaret was back on Helen's schedule. More parties, more introductions. Helen was focusing on men who had titles and money problems. The war had depleted many estates, and American wealth was no longer as available as it had been before. Margaret's £12,000 annual income was not extraordinary, but it was reliable, and reliability mattered. Margaret saw Frances and Brian on the first Sunday of every month. Charles brought them to the flat in Grosvenor Square at 11 in the morning and collected them at 3 in the afternoon. The visits followed the same pattern. Margaret asked about school. The children answered briefly. She offered them biscuits the cook had prepared. They sat in the drawing room for 4 hours with nothing to say to each other. Frances was 12 now and had developed a way of looking at Margaret that suggested assessment rather than affection. Brian was 10 and still hopeful that his mother might suddenly become interested in him. By the end of each visit, he had stopped hoping. Margaret did not enjoy these visits. She performed them because the divorce settlement required them. When Charles collected the children at 3, she felt relief that she tried not to show. Helen told her she needed to be patient. The right opportunity would come. Margaret needed to stay visible, stay elegant, stay available. Margaret stayed medicated. Margaret met Ian Douglas Campbell at a dinner party in March 1951. He was the 11th Duke of Argyll, 46 years old, recently divorced from his second wife. He sat across from Margaret at a table in Mayfair and spent the first course staring at her, without pretending not to. Helen, seated 4 chairs down, noticed immediately. The Duke was not handsome. His face was narrow and severe. He had thinning hair that he combed carefully to disguise the extent of the loss. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his wineglass, a tremor he blamed on wartime injuries, but which had started before the war. What he had instead of handsomeness was a title that dated to 1457 and a Scottish castle that appeared in history books. He was the chief of Clan Campbell. He owned Inverary Castle in Argyll and 45,000 acres of Highland estate. He also had debts that exceeded £200,000, most of them from his second divorce settlement, and years of maintaining a castle that was slowly collapsing. During dinner, the Duke talked about Inverary. He described the castle's architecture, 15th century foundations, 18th century reconstruction, towers that could be seen from 10 miles away. He described the estate, forests, lochs, mountains that had belonged to his family for 5 centuries. He did not mention that the roof leaked in 17 places, that the heating system had failed in 1948 and never been repaired, that he had closed off entire wings because he could not afford to maintain them. Margaret listened. She had been trained to listen to men describe their possessions, and the Duke's possessions were more impressive than most. She asked appropriate questions. She expressed appropriate interest. When the Duke asked if she had ever visited the Highlands, she said she had not. He said she should. He said Inverary in spring was the most beautiful place in Scotland. Helen researched the Duke the next morning. She consulted Debrett's, spoke to friends who knew aristocratic finances, contacted George's solicitor to investigate the estate's condition. What she learned was that the Duke was desperate. His first wife, Louise, had divorced him in 1934, citing cruelty. She claimed he had thrown a burning log at her during an argument, though this was never proven in court. His second wife, Janet, had divorced him in 1950 after 16 years of marriage. Janet's settlement had required him to sell land he could not afford to sell. He was now looking for a third wife who could bring money without demanding too much in return. Helen told Margaret that the Duke was suitable if approached correctly. The title was legitimate. The castle was historic. The debt was manageable if Margaret's money was managed carefully. What mattered was securing the position before the Duke found someone else, or his financial situation deteriorated to the point where even Margaret's income could not help. The courtship was rapid. The Duke called on Margaret 3 days after the dinner. He brought flowers, lilies, which Margaret did not particularly like, but accepted graciously. He asked if she would accompany him to the theater. She agreed. Helen insisted on attending as chaperone. The Duke did not object. He understood the protocols. Over the next 6 weeks, the Duke saw Margaret 14 times. They attended the opera, gallery exhibitions, dinners at restaurants where the Duke was known and treated with deference despite his unpaid bills. He talked constantly about Inverary, the history, the grandeur, the responsibilities of maintaining a castle that was also a symbol of Scottish heritage. Margaret understood what he was doing. He was selling her something. What he was not saying, but what she understood, was that the castle needed her money more than he needed her. In May, the Duke proposed. They were at his London residence, a townhouse in Belgrave Square that belonged to the Argyll estate but was mortgaged to cover previous debts. He presented a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, that had belonged to his grandmother. He said Margaret would make a perfect duchess. He said Inverary needed a woman who understood beauty and elegance. He did not say it needed a woman who could pay for its survival. Margaret accepted. Helen had coached her to accept without hesitation. Hesitation suggested doubt, and doubt gave men time to reconsider. The engagement was announced in the Times on May 23, 1951. The headline read, "Duke of Argyll to marry Mrs. Margaret Sweeney." Margaret was 38 years old. She was about to become a duchess. The wedding preparations were managed by Helen and the Duke's estate solicitor, a man named Forbes who specialized in aristocratic financial arrangements. The financial negotiations took longer than the wedding planning. George's solicitor met with Forbes 7 times to discuss the settlement. What Margaret would bring to the marriage, her £12,000 annual income from Charles, plus an additional £15,000 annually that George would provide, plus a lump sum of £50,000 for immediate estate repairs. What the Duke would provide, the title, the castle, access to aristocratic society at the highest level. The wedding contract included specific clauses about how Margaret's money would be spent. No more than £10,000 annually could go toward Inverary's maintenance without Margaret's explicit approval. The Duke would retain ownership of the castle and lands, but Margaret would have lifetime residence rights. If they divorced, Margaret would keep her title and receive a settlement of £30,000. Margaret signed without reading the full document. Helen had reviewed it. George's solicitor had approved it. Margaret's role was not to understand the contract, but to fulfill it. The wedding took place on March 22, 1951, at Caxton Hall Registry Office. It was a civil ceremony. The Duke's previous divorces meant the Church of Scotland would not marry them. 40 guests attended. Helen wore gray silk. George attended but left immediately after the ceremony. He had business in Glasgow. Charles did not attend. Francis and Brian were not invited. The reception was held at the Dorchester. Champagne was served. The Duke made a toast about tradition and heritage and the future of Clan Campbell. Margaret stood beside him in a pale blue suit and smiled for photographers. She was now Her Grace, the Duchess of Argyll. Helen told her afterward that this was the achievement everything else had been building toward. Margaret had secured the highest position a woman of her origins could reach. She had a title that no amount of money could buy without marriage. She had won. Margaret took her laudanum that night and did not feel victorious. Margaret first saw Inverary Castle in April 1951, 3 weeks after the wedding. They drove north from Glasgow in the Duke's Bentley, a car he had purchased in 1947 and maintained at considerable expense because aristocrats were expected to own certain vehicles regardless of whether they could afford them. The journey took 5 hours. The Duke talked for most of it about the castle's history, the clan chiefs who had lived there, the strategic importance of its location during various Highland conflicts. Margaret watched the landscape change from industrial Glasgow to empty moorland and understood she was entering a kind of exile. The castle appeared in the distance like something from a Gothic novel. 4 conical towers rose above the tree line. The walls were gray stone that had darkened over centuries. The windows were narrow and numerous. As they drove closer, Margaret could see the estate's scale, forests extending in every direction, a loch reflecting the gray sky. Mountains beyond that had no visible human habitation. It was beautiful in the way paintings were beautiful, impressive but not welcoming. The Duke stopped the car at the main entrance. A housekeeper, Mrs. MacLeod, stood waiting. She was 63 and had worked at Inverary since 1920. She curtsied to Margaret, but without enthusiasm. Margaret later learned that Mrs. MacLeod had been loyal to Janet, the second Duchess, and considered Margaret's arrival an intrusion rather than a renewal. Inside, the castle was colder than Margaret had imagined any building could be. The entrance hall had a vaulted ceiling 30 feet high. Portraits of Campbell ancestors lined the walls, men in military dress, women in formal gowns, all of them staring down with expressions that suggested judgment. The Duke explained that the heating system had failed in 1948. He had meant to repair it, but other expenses had taken priority. Margaret asked what temperature the castle reached in winter. The Duke said it depended on how many fireplaces they used. The tour lasted 2 hours. The castle had 127 rooms, though only 30 were in regular use. The Duke showed Margaret the state rooms, the dining hall that could seat 40, the drawing room with tapestries from the 17th century, the library with 15,000 volumes and no cataloging system. He showed her the armory room where weapons from various clan battles were displayed. He showed her the tower where Mary, Queen of Scots, had allegedly stayed in 1563, though historians disputed this. What he did not initially show her were the closed wings. Margaret discovered these on her own the next day. She opened a door off the main corridor and found herself in a hallway where the wallpaper was peeling, where rain had leaked through and stained the ceiling brown, where furniture was covered in sheets and smelled of mildew. She opened 5 more doors and found 5 more examples of decay. The castle was not just old, it was failing. Margaret hired contractors within a week. The Duke had said repairs were needed. What he had not said was that the castle required comprehensive restoration. The roof needed replacing in sections. The plumbing dated to 1890 and leaked constantly. The electrical wiring was dangerous. An inspector Margaret called said parts of it could cause fires. The estimated cost for immediate repairs was £37,000. For complete restoration, closer to £90,000. Margaret used the £50,000 lump sum from her marriage settlement. She hired architects from Edinburgh, craftsmen who specialized in historic properties, decorators who understood how to modernize without destroying period features. The work began in June 1951 and continued for 3 years. Margaret supervised all of it. She met with contractors weekly, approved material selections, reviewed budgets that consistently exceeded projections. The Duke watched this with mixed feelings. He was grateful for the repairs his estate desperately needed. He was also resentful that his new wife had the money to make them when he did not. He began drinking more. Whiskey in the afternoon, more whiskey in the evening. He started criticizing Margaret's choices. The fabrics she selected were too modern. The paint colors were too bright. She was changing things that should remain unchanged. Margaret learned to present decisions as suggestions and to attribute successful outcomes to the Duke's judgment. By 1952, sections of the castle were habitable again. Margaret had restored the heating system, repaired the roof in the residential wing, updated the kitchen to 20th century standards. She had also begun redecorating the staterooms, replacing damaged furniture, restoring paintings, commissioning new drapery. She spent money the way Helen had taught her to spend it, on things that could be photographed, that would appear in magazines, that would prove she belonged in the space she occupied. Country Life ran a feature in October 1952. The new Duchess of Argyll restores in Verare. The article included photographs of Margaret in the drawing room, in the library, on the castle grounds. She wore pearls in every photograph. She smiled in the way she had been trained to smile since she was 14. The article praised her taste, her dedication to preserving Scottish heritage, her understanding of aristocratic responsibility. It did not mention that she had paid for everything it praised, but the castle's restoration could not restore Margaret's marriage. The Duke's resentment grew proportionate to his dependence on her money. He began making comments at dinner, observations that Margaret had been born a commoner, that her father's wealth came from exploiting workers. That title could not change breeding. Margaret did not respond to these comments. Responding would have required admitting she heard them, and admitting would have made them more real. The Duke also resumed patterns from his previous marriages. He was controlling about Margaret's schedule, her correspondence, her friendships. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He read her mail before she received it. He questioned her expenditures even though she was spending her own money. When Margaret objected, he reminded her that she was a guest in his ancestral home, that the castle belonged to Clan Campbell, that being Duchess was a privilege he had granted. By 1954, they were sleeping in separate bedrooms. By 1955, they were barely speaking except when staff or guests were present. The castle was restored. The marriage was not. Margaret had believed the title would provide security, status, a position no one could take from her. What it provided instead was a 400-year-old building in the Scottish Highlands, where she lived with a man who resented everything about her, except her bank account. She increased her laudanum. She started drinking gin in the afternoon. She spent more time in London, where the Duke rarely followed. Margaret began spending more time in London in 1956. The Duke did not object. He was occupied with estate business, meetings with solicitors about debts that continued despite Margaret's money, negotiations with the National Trust about properties he could no longer maintain. Margaret leased a flat in Upper Grosvenor Street, 3 doors down from the house where she had been raised. She hired a maid and a part-time cook. She told the Duke she needed to be in London for medical appointments. The Duke did not ask what kind. The medical appointments were real. Margaret's chronic pain from childbirth had worsened. She was now seeing multiple doctors, one for the pain, one for insomnia, one for anxiety. They prescribed phenobarbital, Seconal, Dexedrine. Margaret took all of it along with the laudanum she had been taking for 20 years. The combination allowed her to function at parties, to smile in photographs, to maintain the appearance that nothing was wrong. She also began seeing other men. The first was a baron's son she met at a gallery opening in March 1957. He was 32, unmarried, handsome in a dissolute way. They had an affair that lasted 6 weeks. It ended when he told Margaret he was engaged to someone else. The second was an American businessman, a friend of Charles's, who was in London for banking negotiations. That lasted 3 months. He returned to New York without saying goodbye. Margaret did not love these men. She was not certain she was capable of love in any conventional sense. What she needed from them was evidence that she was still desirable, still valuable, in the only way she had been taught to be valuable. The affairs were transactional. She provided access and beauty. They provided attention and the temporary illusion that she mattered. In 1959, Margaret met Duncan Sandys. He was 51, a conservative member of Parliament, Winston Churchill's son-in-law. He was married but estranged from his wife. He was also ambitious in ways that made him careless. They met at a dinner party in Belgravia. He was seated next to her. By the end of the evening, he had asked for her telephone number. She gave it to him. The affair with Sandys lasted 3 years. They met at Margaret's London flat, usually in the afternoon when Parliament was not in session. Sandys talked about politics, his rivalries with other MPs, his frustrations with party leadership, his belief that he deserved a cabinet position he had not been offered. Margaret listened the way she always listened to men, with attention that appeared genuine but required nothing from her except presence. Sandys wanted Margaret to divorce the Duke and marry him. He said this repeatedly, usually after sex. When he was less guarded, Margaret told him she would consider it. She did not tell him that divorcing the Duke would mean losing her title, her position, the only achievement Helen had considered worth pursuing. Sandys persisted. He wrote her letters. Not love letters exactly, but letters that discussed their future together, that assumed a future existed. Margaret kept the letters in a drawer in her bedroom. There were also photographs. Margaret did not remember who suggested them. It might have been Sandys. It might have been one of the other men. There were others during this period, though their identities and duration blurred together in her memory. What she remembered was that someone had a Polaroid camera, that photographs were taken in her bedroom, that she had been wearing pearls but nothing else, that the photographs were supposed to be private. The Duke discovered the affair in December 1962. He had hired a private investigator, a former policeman named Campbell, who specialized in aristocratic infidelities. Campbell had followed Margaret for 3 months. He had documented her meetings with Sandys and others. He had also broken into Margaret's London flat while she was in Scotland and searched her belongings. He found letters, diaries, and a locked box that contained photographs. The photographs showed Margaret with multiple men. In most of them, Margaret's face was visible. In some, the men's faces were not, cropped out of frame or obscured by angle. One photograph in particular drew attention. Margaret in her bathroom, naked except for her signature 3-strand pearl necklace, performing a sexual act on a man whose head was not in the frame. The photograph showed only his torso. He became known in all subsequent coverage as the Headless Man. The Duke's solicitor presented the evidence in January 1963. The Duke wanted a divorce. He wanted it on grounds that would absolve him of financial responsibility and publicly humiliate Margaret in the process. His solicitor drafted a petition citing adultery with multiple partners, cruelty, and behavior incompatible with the dignity of her position. The petition was filed in February. Margaret's solicitor advised her to settle quietly. A trial would make everything public. The photographs would be examined in court, described in newspapers, discussed in Parliament. Margaret refused to settle. She told her solicitor that the Duke was lying, that the photographs were fabricated, that this was revenge for her having spent money on the castle. Her solicitor explained that the photographs appeared authentic, that the investigator's testimony would be damaging, that a trial would destroy her reputation completely. Margaret insisted on a trial. She had spent her entire life performing for approval, maintaining appearances, following rules established by people who had power over her. She had married the Duke for a title that was supposed to protect her. Now he was using that title to discard her. She would not make it easy. The trial was scheduled for May 1963. Margaret hired a new solicitor, someone who specialized in high-profile divorces and promised an aggressive defense. They prepared a counter-petition claiming the Duke had been violent, that he had mismanaged her money, that he had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere through his cruelty. The counter-petition included allegations that the Duke had physically assaulted her during arguments, thrown objects, grabbed her forcefully, locked her in rooms. Some of these allegations were true. Some were strategic exaggerations. Margaret could no longer distinguish clearly between what had happened and what her solicitor said would be useful to claim had happened. By April, journalists were calling the upcoming trial the divorce of the decade. Everyone in London society knew it was coming. Invitations to Margaret stopped arriving. Doors that had opened for a duchess began closing for a woman whose private life was about to become public evidence. The trial began on May 2, 1963, at the Court of Session in Edinburgh. Lord Wheatley presided, no relation to Margaret's father, though journalists noted the coincidental surname. The courtroom was open to the public. Every seat was filled. Journalists from Fleet Street occupied the press gallery. The trial was expected to last 4 days. It lasted 11. The Duke's legal team presented their case first. They called the private investigator Campbell, who testified about following Margaret through London. documenting her meetings with various men at her Upper Grosvenor Street flat. He provided dates, times, descriptions of men entering and leaving. He identified Duncan Sandys by name. He identified two other men, a businessman named John Cohane and a sales executive named Peter Combe. He described finding the photographs during his search of Margaret's flat. The photographs were entered as evidence. The judge examined them privately before allowing them to be described in open court. The descriptions were clinical but devastating. The Duke's barrister detailed what each photograph showed: Margaret's body, her face, her pearl necklace, the various sexual acts depicted. The pearl necklace became particularly significant because Margaret wore it constantly, in public photographs and at social events. It authenticated the images in a way that made denial impossible. Margaret sat in the courtroom throughout this testimony. She wore a pale blue suit and her pearls. Her expression remained neutral. Journalists later described her as impassive, cold, showing no emotion. What they could not see was the amount of medication required to achieve that appearance. Margaret had taken Seconal before leaving her hotel that morning, Dexedrine during the lunch recess to counteract the Seconal's sedation, and laudanum in the bathroom during a 15-minute break. Her solicitor cross-examined Campbell aggressively. He questioned the legality of breaking into Margaret's flat, suggested the photographs might have been planted, implied the Duke had orchestrated everything to avoid financial obligations. Campbell's testimony remained consistent. He had found the photographs in a locked box in Margaret's bedroom drawer. He had photographed them before removing them. He had maintained chain of custody. The defense's attacks made no meaningful impact. Duncan Sandys testified on May 7th. He appeared under subpoena. He had tried to avoid testifying, but the court compelled him. He admitted to an affair with Margaret, but denied being the headless man in the most notorious photograph. His testimony was careful, lawyered. He acknowledged meetings at her flat, but characterized them as friendship rather than adultery. When shown letters he had written to Margaret, letters discussing their future together, making plans for her to divorce the Duke, he said they had been taken out of context. The Duke's barrister pressed him about the photographs. Sandys denied participating in them. When asked if he could identify who had, he said he could not. When asked if Margaret had shown him photographs of herself with other men, he paused long enough that his answer became irrelevant. The pause told the court everything it needed to know. Margaret testified on May 9th. She wore black. Her solicitor's choice meant to suggest mourning or dignity. She denied adultery. She admitted to friendships with men, but characterized them as social rather than sexual. She claimed the photographs were fabricated, that enemies of the Duke had created them to damage her reputation. When shown the photographs and asked if that was her body, her face, her bathroom, her pearl necklace, she said the photographs had been altered, that technology existed to create such forgeries. The Duke's barrister cross-examined her for 6 hours over 2 days. He asked about specific dates when Campbell had documented men entering her flat. Margaret said they were friends visiting. He asked why friends visited in the afternoon and left after 2 hours. Margaret said the duration of visits proved nothing. He asked about letters she had written to various men, letters that discussed intimacy, that used language clearly romantic or sexual. Margaret said the letters had been misinterpreted. The barrister then asked about the headless man. He displayed the photograph again, Margaret's face clearly visible, the man's head cropped out of frame. He asked if she could identify him. Margaret refused to answer. The barrister asked again. Margaret said identifying him would destroy his reputation, and she would not do that. The barrister suggested that her refusal to identify him was itself evidence of guilt. Margaret's solicitor objected. The objection was overruled. Speculation about the headless man's identity dominated press coverage. Journalists proposed candidates. Duncan Sandys remained the leading theory despite his denial, but others suggested it was Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., the American actor who had been photographed with Margaret at social events, or Baron Sigismund von Braun, a German aristocrat she had known in the 1950s. Some newspapers published comparison photographs, torso shots of various men held against the cropped torso in Margaret's photograph, attempting anatomical identification. The speculation was salacious, relentless, and never definitively resolved. The Duke testified on May 14th. He described his marriage to Margaret as initially hopeful, but ultimately destructive. He claimed she had spent his money recklessly. He did not mention that it was her money that had restored Inverarray. He claimed she had been unfaithful from the beginning. He provided no evidence predating 1957. He described finding the photographs as the final betrayal, proof that the woman he had elevated to Duchess had degraded herself and his title. Margaret's solicitor cross-examined him about his previous marriages, about allegations of violence, about his financial dependence on Margaret's income. The Duke admitted his finances were complicated but denied dependence. He admitted to arguments with Margaret but denied physical violence. When confronted with Margaret's claims that he had thrown objects and locked her in rooms, he said she was lying to gain sympathy. Lord Wheatley delivered his judgment on May 16th. He found in favor of the Duke on all counts. He granted the divorce on grounds of Margaret's adultery. His written opinion was 43 pages. It described Margaret as a completely promiscuous woman whose behavior was wholly incompatible with the status of a married woman. It stated that her testimony had been a series of lies. It concluded that she had no sense of decency or morality. The judgment was reported in every major newspaper. Margaret was no longer a duchess defending her reputation. She was the woman in the photographs, legally confirmed. The judgment was published in full on May 17, 1963. Newspapers ran excerpts on their front pages. The Evening Standard's headline read, "Duchess called wholly promiscuous." The Daily Mail printed Lord Wheatley's most damning sentences in bold type. The Times, which typically avoided sensationalism, devoted 3 columns to analysis of the case's legal and social implications. Every publication mentioned the photographs. Every publication mentioned the headless man. Margaret left Edinburgh the day after the judgment. She returned to London by train, traveling first class in a private compartment she had paid extra to secure. Journalists waited at King's Cross Station. Photographers positioned themselves along the platform. When Margaret emerged, she was wearing dark glasses and a scarf over her hair, an attempt at disguise that made her more recognizable. The photographs from that day show her surrounded by men with cameras, walking quickly toward a car, her face turned away, but captured anyway. The speculation about the headless man's identity intensified after the trial. Newspapers published lists of potential candidates. Duncan Sandys remained the primary suspect despite his continued denials. In July, his political opponents in Parliament raised questions about his judgment, his fitness for office, his relationship with a woman the courts had condemned. Sandys gave a speech defending his character. He did not mention Margaret by name. He resigned from his ministerial position 3 months later, citing health reasons. Everyone understood the real reason. Other men whose names had been mentioned during the trial, John Cohane, Peter Combe, various actors and aristocrats photographed with Margaret at parties, issued statements denying involvement. Some threatened legal action against newspapers that implied otherwise. None admitted to being the man in the photograph. The photograph itself became iconic in a way Margaret had not anticipated. It was not published in mainstream newspapers. Obscenity laws prevented that. But it circulated privately. Copies were made, distributed, discussed. Margaret's body, her face, her pearl necklace became evidence that thousands of people examined without her consent. Social invitations stopped completely. Women who had attended parties at Inverarray, who had written Margaret-friendly letters, who had welcomed her as Duchess, now avoided her publicly. Men who had pursued her privately now denied knowing her well. Margaret's name became shorthand for scandal, for female sexuality that exceeded acceptable boundaries, for aristocratic disgrace. She retained her title. Scottish law allowed divorced duchesses to continue using their courtesy titles, but the title no longer protected her. If anything, it made the fall more spectacular. She was not just a woman in compromising photographs. She was a duchess in compromising photographs. The combination violated something fundamental about how titles were supposed to function. Titles were meant to elevate, to separate, to place their holders above ordinary moral scrutiny. Margaret's photographs proved that titles protected nothing. Helen died in November 1963, 6 months after the trial. She had a stroke in her flat in Mayfair. Margaret was not with her when it happened. She was notified by Helen's housekeeper. She arrived at the hospital an hour after Helen had died. Looking at her mother's body in the hospital bed, Margaret felt something she could not name. Not grief exactly, but a sense that the architecture supporting her life had collapsed. Helen had constructed Margaret, managed her, directed every significant decision. Without Helen, Margaret had no clear understanding of what she was supposed to do next. George was still alive, but distant. He was 76 and had largely withdrawn from business operations. He had followed the trial in the newspapers, but never contacted Margaret during it. After Helen's death, he wrote Margaret a brief letter saying he would continue her financial support at the current level. He did not offer sympathy. He did not invite her to visit. The letter was signed Father without additional sentiment. Margaret remained in her London flat. She had nowhere else to go. Inverary was closed to her. The Duke had made that clear through his solicitors. She could not return to Scotland without encountering people who had read about her in the newspapers. London was hostile, but at least it was familiar. She hired a new solicitor in 1964 to pursue financial claims against the Duke. The divorce settlement had been minimal. The Duke had successfully argued that Margaret's adultery voided her right to significant support. Margaret's solicitor argued that her contributions to Inverary's restoration entitled her to compensation. The case proceeded through Scottish courts for 2 years. In 1966, the court ruled against her. Margaret had restored the castle voluntarily as the Duke's wife. She had no legal claim to reimbursement. The financial situation grew worse. Margaret's annual income, $12,000 from Charles's original divorce settlement, $15,000 from George, had seemed substantial in 1951. By 1965, inflation and her spending habits made it inadequate. She still maintained the London flat, still employed staff, still purchased clothes from designers who would still serve her. The expenses exceeded her income by £3,000 annually. She began borrowing against her trust, taking loans from banks that charged interest she could not comfortably afford. She also increased her medication. By 1967, she was taking Seconal, Dexedrine, Valium, and Laudanum daily. The combination allowed her to sleep at night and function during the day, but function was becoming harder to define. She attended fewer social events because she was invited to fewer. She saw her children rarely. Francis was married now and living in Surrey. Brian was working in finance and had made it clear he preferred minimal contact. When they did visit, the conversations were brief and strained. Margaret asked about their lives. They answered politely. No one mentioned the trial. By 1968, Margaret was 55. She had been famous for beauty at 20, notorious for scandal at 50. The notoriety had a longer half-life than the beauty. People still discussed her at parties she was not invited to, still speculated about the headless man's identity, still used her name as a reference point for female excess. She had become a story people told, a cautionary example, a piece of social history that existed independently of the person who had lived it. George died in February 1970. He was 79. The cause was pneumonia following a stroke that had left him partially paralyzed for 8 months. Margaret learned about it from his solicitor, not from any family member who might have called first. The solicitor telephoned her London flat to inform her that the funeral would be held in Glasgow, that George had left instructions for a private service, and that Margaret's attendance was not expected. Margaret attended anyway. She took the train to Glasgow and a taxi to the church. She arrived 20 minutes before the service began and sat in the back row. Approximately 40 people attended. Business associates, former employees, distant relatives Margaret barely recognized. No one spoke to her. When the service ended, she left before anyone could decide whether to acknowledge her presence. George's will was read the following week. He had divided his estate among various business partners, charitable foundations, and a trust for Francis and Brian. Margaret received a lump sum of £20,000 and the continuation of her annual £15,000 income for 5 years, after which it would cease. The will specified that this was adequate provision for a daughter whose choices have reflected poorly on the family name. Margaret's income was now reduced to £27,000 annually, 12 from Charles's settlement, 15 from George's temporary provision. This would decline to $12,000 in 1975. Her expenses remained unchanged. The London flat cost $6,000 annually to lease. Staff cost another $4,000. Clothing, medical bills, maintenance of appearances, all of it added up to expenditures she could no longer sustain. She began selling possessions in 1971. Small items at first, jewelry she rarely wore, furniture from storage, paintings she had purchased during her marriage to Charles. She used dealers who were discreet, who would not mention the Duchess of Argyll was liquidating assets. The sales brought in enough to cover her deficit for 18 months. The medication continued. By 1972, Margaret's prescriptions came from 3 different doctors who did not coordinate with each other. One prescribed Valium for anxiety, another prescribed Seconal for insomnia. The third prescribed Dexedrine for what he called energy deficiency. Margaret also continued purchasing laudanum from a chemist in Chelsea who did not ask questions. The combination made her days manageable, but her memory unreliable. She would lose hours without accounting for them. She would start conversations and forget what she was saying mid-sentence. She also began drinking more systematically. Gin in the afternoon had become gin throughout the afternoon. By 1973, she was consuming a bottle every 2 days. The alcohol interacted with the medication in ways that frightened her when she allowed herself to think about it. But thinking required clarity she was actively avoiding. Francis visited in 1974. She was 40 now, married to a businessman living in Surrey with 2 daughters Margaret had met only 3 times. Francis came to the London flat on a Wednesday afternoon. She brought photographs of the granddaughters. Margaret looked at them and struggled to remember their names. Francis corrected her gently. They had tea. Francis asked about Margaret's health. Margaret said she was fine. Francis asked about her finances. Margaret said they were adequate. Francis then said she was concerned. She had heard from friends, people who had seen Margaret at the few social events she still attended, that Margaret appeared unwell, that her speech was sometimes slurred, that she had fallen at a gallery opening the previous month. Margaret denied falling. She said she had tripped on uneven flooring. Francis did not argue. She finished her tea and left after 40 minutes. She did not visit again for 2 years. In 1975, George's temporary income provision ended. Margaret's annual income dropped to £12,000. Her expenses remained above $20,000. She sold more possessions, a diamond bracelet, 2 fur coats, a painting she had purchased in 1952. The sales covered the deficit for another year. By 1977, Margaret owed money to multiple creditors. The lease on her London flat was in arrears. She owed her solicitor for work he had done on a failed attempt to sue a newspaper for libel. She owed medical bills to doctors who had stopped treating her until payment was received. She borrowed from friends, small amounts, £200 here, £500 there, always with promises to repay that she did not keep. Brian visited once in 1978. He was 43, working in international finance, traveling frequently. He came to the flat on a Saturday morning. Margaret was still in her dressing gown at 11. She offered him coffee. He declined. He said he had come to discuss her situation. He had heard from Francis, from creditors who had contacted him, from George's former solicitor, who felt obligated to inform the family that Margaret was in financial collapse. Brian offered to help on one condition. Margaret would need to move to a smaller flat, reduce her expenses, stop borrowing money she could not repay. Margaret refused. She said she was the Duchess of Argyll, that certain standards were required, that reducing her circumstances would mean admitting defeat. Brian said defeat had already occurred. Margaret asked him to leave. The eviction notice arrived in March 1980. The landlord had filed for possession after Margaret failed to pay rent for 7 months. The court hearing was scheduled for May. Margaret's solicitor advised her not to contest it. She had no defense, no money for continued rent, no realistic plan for resolving the debt. Margaret attended the hearing anyway. She wore her pearls. The judge granted possession to the landlord. Margaret was given 60 days to vacate. She moved to a smaller flat in Pimlico in July 1980. 2 bedrooms instead of 5. No staff. She could no longer afford anyone. She packed what she could fit and sold the rest. The moving process took 3 weeks. She found photographs during the packing, images from her debutante season, from her wedding to Charles, from parties at Inverarray before everything collapsed. She burned most of them in the fireplace. Keeping them felt like maintaining evidence of a trial that never ended. The Pimlico flat was adequate but depressing. The building had thin walls. She could hear neighbors arguing, children crying, the sounds of people living ordinary lives. Margaret had never lived an ordinary life. She did not know how to begin. She increased the Valium. She stopped answering the telephone. She saw almost no one. Margaret stopped paying rent on the Pimlico flat in January 1985. She had stopped because there was no money left to pay with. Charles's divorce settlement income had ended in 1983. It had been structured to continue for 50 years, or until his death, whichever came first. Charles had died of a heart attack in Monte Carlo in October 1983. He was 74. Margaret learned about it from a newspaper obituary, not from her children. The obituary mentioned his golf career, his marriages, his 2 children. It did not mention Margaret by name, referring to her only as his first wife. Without that income, Margaret had nothing. George's provision had ended in 1975. She had no remaining assets to sell. Everything of value had been liquidated over the previous decade. She applied for public assistance in February 1985. The application was processed by a social worker named Mrs. Richardson, who reviewed Margaret's financial history and asked why someone who had once been wealthy now had nothing. Margaret did not have an answer that satisfied Mrs. Richardson or herself. The assistance provided £300 monthly. Margaret's rent was $280. That left £20 for food, medication, utilities, and everything else required to continue existing. It was not enough. Margaret stopped eating regularly. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. By summer, her clothes hung loose. Her face, which had been photographed thousands of times for its beauty, now showed the specific devastation of malnutrition and pharmaceutical dependence. The medication had become the only constant. Margaret was taking Valium throughout the day, sometimes forgetting she had already taken it and taking more. She was also drinking, though alcohol now came from the cheapest available sources. The combination produced episodes where she lost consciousness in her flat and woke hours later on the floor, unsure how she had gotten there. Frances received a call from a neighbor in August 1985. The neighbor, Mrs. Patel, lived in the flat below Margaret's. She said she had heard a fall, had knocked on Margaret's door for 20 minutes without response, and was concerned something had happened. Frances drove to Pimlico that afternoon. She used the key Margaret had given her years earlier, when giving keys to children still seemed like something a mother should do. She found Margaret unconscious in the bathroom. An empty bottle of Valium was on the sink. Frances called an ambulance. Margaret was taken to St. Thomas's Hospital, where doctors treated her for an overdose they could not determine was accidental or intentional. Margaret regained consciousness 2 days later. When asked what had happened, she said she could not remember. Frances visited her in the hospital. She sat beside the bed and said they needed to discuss Margaret's living situation. Margaret could not continue alone in the Pimlico flat. She was a danger to herself. Frances had researched options. There were facilities, nursing homes that could provide supervision, that accepted patients with limited means. Margaret refused immediately. She said she would not live in an institution, that she was the Duchess of Argyll, that such places were beneath her. Frances said the title no longer meant anything. Margaret said it was all she had left. Frances said that made her point. The eviction notice for the Pimlico flat arrived in September while Margaret was still in the hospital. The landlord cited non-payment and the disturbance caused by the ambulance visit. The hearing was scheduled for October. Frances attended on Margaret's behalf. The judge granted possession. Margaret was given 30 days to vacate once she was discharged from hospital. Margaret was discharged on October 12, 1985. She had nowhere to go. Frances arranged temporary accommodation at a residential hotel in Earl's Court, while they decided on permanent placement. The hotel was grim, a converted Victorian house with shared bathrooms and residents who were primarily elderly, poor, or both. Margaret's room was on the 3rd floor. No elevator. She had to climb stairs that exhausted her. The room had a single bed, a wardrobe, a sink. The window overlooked a brick wall. She stayed there for 6 weeks. During that time, Frances researched nursing homes that would accept someone with Margaret's financial situation and medical needs. She found one in Pimlico, a Victorian building that had been converted to residential care in the 1970s. The rooms were small but private. The staff was adequate. The cost was covered by public assistance with a supplemental payment Frances agreed to provide. Margaret visited the facility in November. Frances accompanied her. They were shown a room on the 3rd floor, 12 feet by 10, with space for a bed, a chair, a small wardrobe. A window overlooked the street. Margaret asked if this was the best available. The administrator said it was. Margaret asked if there were other options. The administrator said there were not, given her financial constraints. Margaret moved in on December 3, 1985. She brought 2 suitcases of clothing, a box of photographs she had not burned, and her jewelry. Most of it costume pieces now, but she still had her pearls. Everything else was gone. The furniture from Inverary had been auctioned in 1984 to cover the Duke's debts. He had died in 1973, and his estate had spent a decade settling obligations. The furniture from the London flats had been sold or abandoned. The life Margaret had constructed over 70 years reduced to what could fit in a 12 by 10 room. The facility required residents to attend meals in a common dining room. Margaret refused for the first 2 weeks. She ate in her room, food brought by staff who were paid to be patient with difficult residents. Eventually, hunger and isolation forced her to comply. She went to the dining room wearing her pearls and full makeup. Other residents stared. Most of them did not know who she was. Those who did seemed uncertain whether to acknowledge it. Frances visited monthly. Brian visited twice in 5 years. Margaret's granddaughters never visited. Frances had decided they should not, that seeing their grandmother in such circumstances would serve no purpose. Margaret asked about them occasionally. Frances showed her photographs. Margaret looked at them and seemed to struggle with recognition. The medication and alcohol had damaged her memory. She knew she had granddaughters. She could not consistently remember their names. By 1988, Margaret rarely left her room. She sat in her chair by the window and watched the street. Sometimes she talked to herself, conversations with Helen, with Charles, with the Duke, with people who were dead or had stopped caring decades ago. Margaret fell in her room on March 14, 1990. She had gotten up to use the bathroom at 3 in the morning and lost her balance. She lay on the floor for 40 minutes before a night nurse making rounds found her. The fall fractured her hip. She was taken to Westminster Hospital where surgeons operated the following day. The recovery was complicated. Margaret was 77. Decades of medication had weakened her bones. The fracture would not heal properly. She returned to the nursing home in April, transferred to a room on the ground floor. Room 324. It was smaller than her previous room, 10 feet by 8. The window looked onto an internal courtyard where nothing grew. A hospital bed replaced the regular bed she had used before. She could no longer walk without assistance. A nurse came twice daily to help her to the bathroom, to change her clothing, to administer the medications that now included painkillers for the hip. Margaret's mind began failing in ways that were not entirely attributable to medication. She would tell stories about parties at Inverary to nurses who had not asked. She would describe dresses she had worn in 1951 with perfect detail, then forget she had eaten breakfast 20 minutes earlier. She confused time periods, talking about Charles as though they were still married, asking when Helen was coming to visit, referring to Frances and Brian as children who needed collecting from school. The nursing home staff were kind in the mechanical way institutional kindness operates. They performed their duties without cruelty, but also without particular warmth. Margaret was one of 43 residents, most of them elderly and deteriorating in various ways. She received the care her payment tier provided, adequate but not exceptional. The staff knew she had been someone once. Some of the older nurses remembered the trial. They did not mention it. Frances visited less frequently after the fall, once every 2 months, then once every 3. The visits were difficult. Margaret often did not recognize her immediately. When she did, the conversations were repetitive. Margaret would ask the same questions. When was she going home? Where were her things? Why was she in this room? Frances would answer, and 10 minutes later, Margaret would ask again. Brian visited in December 1990. It was his first visit in 18 months. He sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed and attempted conversation. Margaret stared at him for several minutes before saying his name uncertainly. He confirmed his identity. She asked if he had come from school. He said no. She asked again 5 minutes later. The visit lasted 25 minutes. Brian left and told Frances by telephone that he could not do this anymore, that the woman in that room was not their mother in any meaningful sense. Margaret's daily routine contracted to the size of her room. She woke at 7 when nurses came to help her dress. She insisted on full makeup every morning, foundation, powder, lipstick applied with shaking hands that no longer achieved precision. She insisted on wearing her pearls. The nurses allowed this, though the pearls sometimes got tangled in her nightgown and had to be carefully removed. She ate breakfast in her room, porridge usually, toast, tea that grew cold while she forgot to drink it. She spent mornings sitting in the chair by the window, looking at the courtyard, occasionally talking to people who were not there. Lunch was brought at noon. She ate perhaps half of what was provided. Afternoons she slept, or attempted to sleep, or lay in bed in the space between sleep and waking where memory and present circumstance merged into something indistinguishable. By 1991, Margaret's recognition of her own life had become unreliable. She would sometimes tell nurses she needed to prepare for a party that evening. She would ask them to help her select a dress from a wardrobe that contained only 3 house dresses and 2 nightgowns. When reminded there was no party, she would become agitated or confused, sometimes both. The nurses learned not to contradict her directly. They would say the party had been postponed, that she should rest now, that someone would tell her when it was time. The photographs she had brought with her, the box of images from various decades, remained in her wardrobe. She looked at them occasionally during her first year in room 324. By 1992, she stopped looking. Memory had become too painful or too confusing or simply too much effort. The photographs stayed in the box. Eventually, a nurse moved them to the top shelf of the wardrobe, where Margaret could not reach them without assistance she never asked for. The Duke of Argyll had died in 1973, but Margaret sometimes spoke of him as though he were still alive, still someone she needed to consider, still someone whose approval mattered. She would tell nurses she needed to call him, that he was expecting her at Inverarray, that the castle required her attention. The nurses would nod and say perhaps tomorrow. Margaret would forget by tomorrow. Frances made her last visit in October 1992. Margaret was 80 by then, though she did not seem to know this. The conversation was brief because Margaret could not maintain focus. She kept asking where Helen was. Frances explained that Helen had died in 1963. Margaret seemed to accept this, then asked again 10 minutes later. Frances left after 30 minutes. She cried in her car before driving home. She did not visit again. She told herself her mother was already gone, that the woman in room 324 was something else, a biological remainder, a body continuing past the point where the person had ceased. Margaret stopped wearing makeup in early 1993. The nurses continued offering to help her apply it, but she refused or forgot why it mattered. The pearls remained. She wore them every day until a night in February when a nurse found her in bed with the pearls clutched in her hand, the clasp broken, the individual pearls scattered across the blanket. The nurse collected them carefully and placed them in a small box. Margaret never asked for them again. She stopped eating adequately in March. Food would arrive and sit untouched. Nurses encouraged her to eat. She would take 1 or 2 bites, then push the plate away or forget it was there. She was losing weight rapidly now. Her clothes no longer fit. Her face had become skeletal. The nursing home physician discussed options with Frances by telephone. Frances authorized palliative care. No interventions, just comfort. Margaret died on July 25, 1993 at 4:17 in the morning. A night nurse was present, but Margaret was unconscious. The death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia and heart failure. She was 80 years old. Frances arranged a small funeral. 14 people attended. Brian came from Geneva, where he was working. 2 former staff members from the nursing home came. The rest were distant relatives or people whose connection to Margaret was unclear, even to Frances. There were no photographers, no journalists. The Times ran an obituary that mentioned her marriages, her title, and the 1963 trial. It did not mention how she died or where. Margaret was cremated. Her ashes were not interred at Inverarray. The current Duke, a distant Campbell relative she had never met, declined permission. Frances kept the ashes in an urn in her home for 2 years before scattering them in the Thames on a gray afternoon when no one was watching. The photographs survived. The notorious images from the trial were never published in mainstream outlets during Margaret's lifetime, but after her death they circulated more freely, first in books about aristocratic scandal, then on the internet when that became possible. The headless man was never definitively identified. Duncan Sandys died in 1987 without confirming or denying. Other candidates died similarly silent. The question remained unanswered, which perhaps was the point. The photograph's power was never about the man's identity. It was about Margaret's face being visible while his was not. Her children inherited nothing of value. The pearls had been costume. The title died with her. Divorced duchesses retained courtesy titles only during their lifetimes. Frances and Brian rarely discussed their mother after her death. When they did, it was in practical terms: dates, facts, arrangements, not feelings. What remains is a question without a satisfactory answer. What was Margaret Wheatley promised that Margaret Campbell never received? She had beauty, wealth, titles, access to every room that mattered. She ended in one that did not. The distance between those 2 points is where her life actually occurred, in the space between what she was told she could become and what she was allowed to be. The photographs are still findable. The trial transcripts are public record. The castle still stands in Scotland, restored with her money, occupied by people who have no memory of her. She was the Duchess of Argyll. Then she was not. Then she was gone. The world noticed the first transformation. It barely registered the second.